Olean, and salutations to the Truth Core, whoever and wherever you may be on the planet. I'm here today, the 14th of September, 2021, with a follow-up of a talk released on the 31st of December, 2020, the parable of the golden eggs. So when I initially released that talk, I said there would be a follow-up, part 2, and here it is. And the subtitle, or leading theme, of this follow-up is Ancestral Worship. The natural place to begin is with a short reprise of the parable. It's quite simple, actually, and it helps if you visualize it. So you're walking in a park somewhere, a beautiful park, and there are other people around. Let's say you're alone that day. The other people are strangers, but everyone's friendly, passing each other, sometimes looking at each other in an amiable way, even smiling. And you notice someone coming across the park in your direction. They catch your attention for some reason. Let's say it's a woman. She's about 5'8", quite well-dressed, well-mannered, obviously someone who displays dignity and uprightness in her behavior, possibly even someone that you would trust upon first encounter, although, of course, trust is a huge issue in human affairs, isn't it? So she comes before you in a gentle way, in an inviting way, and she says, "I have a gift for you. Hold out your hand." So she holds out her hand, palm down, and she tells you to put yours under it, palm up, and she drops a golden egg into your hand. That is the first golden egg. Now, the parable states that when you receive that egg, you don't have to know who the stranger is. It's an anonymous donation. And so you receive the golden egg in your palm, and the stranger greets you farewell and walks away, and you never have to know who it was that gave you the first golden egg. That golden egg is what you call, what everyone calls, the gift of common sense. It's a generic gift. Human animals have it. They all have it in different measures, and yet it is one of those things that I call sometimes a factory installation. You have it by default. Now, whether you use it or not, or how well you use it, is another issue. It could well be said that the entire Soviet deceit currently unfolding on the planet depends on trusting in a lie, and yet the mere application of common sense can easily overturn that lie. So it's fair to say that this Soviet deception is a test of common sense for every single human animal living on this planet. So common sense is a generic faculty. It's common to our entire species. And you can enjoy it and use it with no regard whatsoever as to how you acquired it. It's the gift of an anonymous donor. Coming to the second golden egg, the situation is different. So on this occasion, a stranger approaches you across the park. Once again, you feel comfortable in this first encounter. You feel that there is some goodwill or benevolence streaming from the presence of this individual. And he stands there and performs the same ritual. He says, "I have a gift for you." So he puts out his hand, palm down. You put your hand under it, palm up. And do you receive the egg? No, you don't receive the egg. Your two palms stand there, one facing the other. You anticipate something to drop into your palm. Say if you received the first golden egg, then you expect another egg to drop. When the second egg drops, I like that. That's a good meme. So you're waiting for the second egg to drop rather than the second shoe to drop. I believe that meme goes, waiting for the other shoe to drop. So, the other egg is not dropping. And of course, the stranger who's offering it to you knows that and knows that you are wondering why not. So now there's a little conversation. In the first case, when you received the first golden egg, there was no conversation following the statement, I have a gift for you. Nothing else was required. The donor remained anonymous. So this time, the benevolent stranger nods his head, smiles, and he says, yes, I know. It's different this time, isn't it? And may I tell you how it's different? And you, of course, respond, yes, please do. And the stranger says, there is a requirement for receiving the second golden egg. And it's simple, and it's the same for everyone. You must know, you who receive it, must know who is giving it to you. You must know who it comes from. Otherwise, the other egg won't drop. Simple. Well, you pause for a moment, and then, of course, where does the conversation go from there? Well, if I were you, or if you were me, you would simply say, well, I don't know what to do now because you're a perfect stranger, and I don't know who you are. What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to figure it out? Or do you intend to tell me? And the answer coming from the stranger is rather strange. It has a little trick in it. So the stranger says, well, I won't tell you. That is another condition of this gift. I myself, the donor, won't tell you, but someone else will. And he pauses to let this sink in for a moment, and then he says, I'm guessing that you might want to know who that someone else is, who's going to tell you who I am so you can receive the second egg. And of course, what do? You nod and you say, yes, surely. And then he says, the someone else is the inventor of this parable. The stranger pauses for a minute, looks at you carefully, but kindly, to make sure you take in that statement. And then he says, all right, we're done now. I don't have to be here when you find out who I am, but I will always be here. I'm always with you. And when you learn who I am, all you have to do is hold out your hand, and the egg will appear in your hand, like magic. So that completes the parable of the golden eggs. And of course, since I'm the author of the parable, it falls upon me to tell you who the anonymous donor is. One of the lovely tricks of this parable, and a parable is simply a learning device, is that the first and second donors are the same. So when you know who the second one is, you also know who the first one was. Additional to common sense, which comes to you as an innate endowment of your species, there is a second sense, divine sense. I might have quoted a passage from the Hermetica in the original parable, where you actually find the Latin sensa divina. So the divine sense is the second golden egg, and you acquire it by knowing that it comes from your ancestral lineage. Common sense has nothing ancestral in it. Just look at the term. Common. What does that mean? It means it is generic to all races. It has no ancestral background behind it. It doesn't need to have, because it is a universal, and in this rare instance I'll use that term. You know, I'm against the concept and the ideology of universality, but in this case it's true. Common sense is a universal gift, regardless of your background, regardless of your race. But in order to receive the divine sense, you need to recognize that it comes to you in your connection with your ancestors, your racial forerunners. Now, on that note, I invite you to consider, if I may be so bold, the subtitle of this talk, Ancestral Worship. What is ancestral worship? Well, it's a very big deal in human affairs, in all races and cultures around the world, and has been for untold millennia. In the past, in the ancient past, some form of ancestral worship was basic to every culture. And many historians have pointed this out. And there is an enormous body of study in the ancestral worship of ancient peoples. Remarkably, the custom of ancestral worship has survived in many ways and in many countries, particularly in Asia. It's very strong, but not only there. But in Asia, among, say, the Chinese and peoples of Southeast Asia and peoples of India, you find that factor of ancestral worship survives, and there are ceremonies and observances dedicated to that practice. The illustration for this talk shows a ceremony at Samhain, which is at the beginning of November each year, and it was one of the 4 Celtic ceremonies that were performed on what are called the cross-quarter days. So there are 4 days in the year marked by the solstices and equinoxes, and those days are 90 days apart. But if you go to day 45, at the midpoint, say, between summer, the summer solstice, and the fall equinox, you come to the beginning of August, and that is a cross-quarter day. So there are 4 of those days, and the one that falls in the beginning of November is called Samhain, and that was, and still is, celebrated in the tradition of the Celtic peoples. So what you see there is an image of a pagan with ceremonial antlers lighting a torch on the evening of Samhain. And of course, that has been converted in a vulgar way into Halloween. Traditionally, in England and other countries, it was called All Souls Night, and it was dedicated to the dead. In Mexico, it's celebrated as the Day of the Dead, and it's a huge festival in Mexico. So you can recognize in those celebrations of the Day of the Dead a strong surviving form of ancestral worship. People go to the cemeteries on that day, and they observe the memory of their ancestors and offer gratitude and recognition for what they have received from their ancestors. So far, so good. Now let's look a little more closely at this concept of ancestor worship. I'm making an exception here because, in fact, I do not include the word worship in my vocabulary. It's not in my syntax, as the sorcerers say. I don't worship anything. I don't feel obligated to worship anything. As you know, I hold the Earth Mother, your Divine Mother, Sophia, in the highest regard, but I do not worship Sophia, and Sophia does not expect me to worship her. I don't like this word worship. It's tainted, it's corrupted. It comes with a connotation, in some respects, of a slave-master relationship. This is obviously unacceptable. How often have you heard about Sunday services, for instance? So, Tads get together, the family gets together. This happened in the little village of Friendship, Maine, where I lived. And on Sunday, they go into church to worship God. Correct? So, the congregation is there gathered. We are gathered here today to worship God. This notion of worshiping God is really sick and totally unacceptable in what you might call modern spirituality. And it's completely unacceptable in planetary tantra and in the living gnosis I teach today. One of the powerful beliefs attached to the worship of God is that you, the worshiper, love God. So fundamental to the belief system still of millions, billions around the world is this notion that you love God. You do it for the love of God. The love you feel for God is something that fills your life as a person of faith, and it sustains you and directs you, and so on and so forth. And that is entirely delusional. Anyone who tells you that they love God may as well be telling you that they can drink water from a stone. It so happens possibly that if you have a small round stone and you put it in your mouth and you suck on it, doing so you will generate saliva, you will generate liquid in your mouth by sucking on a stone. But you wouldn't turn around then and say that that liquid comes from the stone, would you? So worshiping God for the love of God is like sucking on a stone. On the other hand, ancestral commemoration is something real. It's concrete, it's existential. It involves what I would call a palpable emotion. A palpable emotion is like what you feel toward a dog or cat, or anything you love, an object, a place, a person. It's palpable. You can actually taste it. And you can connect to something that is real through that emotion. But the emotion or presumed emotion of love for God is unreal, and it cannot do anything but produce despair and devastation in your heart, even though it may appear to those who are caught in that delusion that it gives them a life-sustaining force and they can't live without it. Well, we'll see about that soon enough. Now, in concluding this talk, let me see if I can outline for you something about the depth of ancestral commemoration. It has different depths. It's as if you were standing over a pool of water and you looked into the pool, gazed into it, and at first you realized you could only see down into the pool for maybe a foot or so. But then you look deeper and you can see the water deeper in the pool, and you continue to look and you can see it again deeper and deeper until perhaps you even find the source of the pool. You see at the bottom of the pool some commotion of the water, and then you realize, oh, there is a bubbling spring down there at the bottom of the pool. Ancestral commemoration has several levels of depth like that. It begins, of course, at the most immediate and accessible level with your blood kin ancestors, your genealogical ancestors that you know, your mother and father, grandmother and grandfather, great-grandmother and great-grandfather, and so on. And by the way, I think it's well known today that there is a large interest in tracing one's ancestral background, and there are websites and services that can provide you with a genealogical tree. So you might be able to go in some depth in the process to identify who your remote ancestors are in your genealogical bloodline. I used to have quite a number of friends in Belgium who were in the Belgian nobility, and my closest friend, Geoffroy, who was a Belgian count, was really interested in his family ancestry. They all are. Of course they are, because it gives them their credentials. Now, it's been shown that to a certain extent, these credentials are made up. But to another extent, yeah, it could be possible, especially with the records kept by those families in Europe, such as Geoffroy's family, the family of de Bouillon, that you could find ancestral records. Geoffroy had in his house a large, what was it made of? It was made of some kind of parchment, some kind of treated parchment. It was about 4 feet wide and 4 feet tall. It was hanging on the wall of his house, and there it had his ancestral tree that went all the way back to Godefroy de Bouillon, who was a Belgian knight, French Belgian knight in the Crusades. So I used to study this diagram and look at all the names, and it had some amazing names on it, some of which I knew from my historical studies, such as Mathilde of Tuscany and others. So that is possible, but that is not really the direction of ancestral commemoration that applies to the parable of the 2 golden eggs. Let's say then that the first level of depth concerns those ancestors whom you can identify by name in your genealogical bloodline. That stops, that phases out at a certain point. And then you go to the next level. And in the next level of your ancestry are all those who lived unnamed and unknown, most of them unnamed and unknown, who lived in the experience and embodiment of your ancestral lineage, your racial lineage. Take myself for an example. I'm an easy example. So my father's line was Irish, and my mother's line was Italian. Now, I don't know much about my family background. I never met my grandparents. And My father died before I was born, so the first level of ancestral recognition for me is very shallow. It goes off into the deeper water, and there you find the line of all the people of Irish descent who lived before me, on the one hand, and all the people of Italian descent who lived before me. And that's a lot of people. But they belong to my ancestral lineage just as much as my known parents do. So I'm not talking here about a sentimental attachment to family members that you may know about. Your great-grandfather or grandfather who fought in the First World War or something like that. Certainly it is valuable if you know that, and you can remember who these people were, not through your own direct memory of knowing them, but through the family records. And that is valuable, and that is one step, but as I've said, it's only the first level. The second level is, of course, very deep. What am I talking about here? All my Irish ancestors. How do I know who they were? Well, there are two ways to gaze into that deeper level of the ancestral well of memory. One of them is to just learn about the history of the Irish people, the history of the nation of Ireland. Each people has its own land, its own nation. Remember the triple formula: race, place, and language, RPL. So, got the race, the Irish, place is Ireland, and then the language. So I can study Gaelic, I can look at the native language of the Irish peoples, and I can pursue the commemoration or observe the act of commemoration by looking at the history of my people. The second way is that I can look at the legend of my people. And in order to do that, you go into the folklore and the mythology of your ancestors. And there you will find certain figures are named. Now, in some cases, these figures may be quite remote in time, and they may be historical or quasi-historical. But they also may be purely legendary. I'll give you an example. In Irish folklore, there is a poet whose name is Fionn, spelled, get ready for this, F-I-O-N-N. Irish spellings are quite difficult because they don't sound like they look. So Fionn was an Irish poet, a legendary poet. You cannot nail him down to an historical figure. So when I look back into the second level of the well of ancestral memory, I see figures like this, and I know that Fionn was my ancestor in a way that is just as real as my biological parents and grandparents. I do not have to trace my genealogical lineage to him. No, it doesn't have to be straightforward and literal in that way. What I receive from Fionn comes through cultural inheritance. But that is the second egg. And can you see why you don't receive the second egg unless you know who you're receiving it from? It requires an act on your part, an act of commemoration, to go and find who your legendary cultural ancestors are. But what you receive from them is every bit as real as important, and in some ways may prove to be more so than what you receive from your recognizable genealogy. So here's an example of something that I receive in that way. This is a saying attributed to him. He was an Irish bard and a poet. All desires save one are fleeting, but that one lasts forever. Finn, with all desires, had the lasting one, for he would go anywhere and forsake anything for wisdom. That's a saying from my cultural ancestry. And I can make that saying my own and take it into myself as it applies to my life. And it becomes something that inspires me and guides me, you see. Something else that is attributed to him is this. A poem is a revelation, and it is by the brink of running water that poetry is revealed to the human mind. You might be someone who got advice and sayings from your parents or other relatives. You might be someone who as a child sat on the knees of your grandfather or stood in the kitchen with your great-grandmother and she said things to you and you registered them and carried them with you for the rest of your life. You can do the same with your remote cultural ancestors. And that is a form of ancestral worship. You see what I'm getting at? To say a little more about the second depth of commemoration, I want to point out that everyone who undertakes to know these things about their ancestry, for instance, if you're Greek, you will go back into the history of Greece if you want, or back into the folklore and legend of the Greek people. At a certain moment, it's no longer history. You go back beyond a certain date, and it's no longer history. For instance, the Greek Homeric heroes of the Iliad and the Odyssey, take Odysseus of the Odyssey. He's not an historical figure. He's a legendary folk hero. So what you find are legendary actors in your ancestral lineage, folk heroes and folk heroines. For instance, if you're British, there is the famous historical, actually, figure of Boudica. Boudica, she was a Celtic woman in Britain at the time of the Roman invasions, and there are fabulous stories about her and what a fierce warrior she was. So you could look back at her as your ancestor. And there's a large, large depth in the middle region of the well of memory. So at the third level, you come to your mythological ancestors. And these, of course, will appear often in human form. They may also appear as animals or serpents or unicorns or some other kind of mythical creature. But at the third and lowest depth of the well, this is what you find. And do you know today what you would know if you looked into the well at that depth? Do you know who your ancestral, mythical ancestors are? How do you find out who they are? Well, you go into the mythology of your race. Remember I said in the talk, mythology is racial. There is no myth that has come into this world ever that did not come from the origins of a specific people, of a specific race who spoke a specific language. So if you're Iranian, you can go back to Iranian mythology. If you're Japanese, you go back to Japanese mythology. If you're Greek or Mexican, as you might be called, having ancestry with the Toltec and Aztec people, you go back to the gods and goddesses of those ancient cultures, and then you are at the source. You're at the bottom of the well where it all comes from. So if you were Mexican, for instance, and you looked at your origins in the indigenous culture of Mexico, you might recognize Xochiquetzal or Itzpapalotl, the obsidian butterfly woman. And were you to recognize that mythical figure in your racial ancestry, what would you have? What is the point of that recognition? What is the point of looking into the full depth of the well? You connect to what has been called an archetype, which I prefer to call an engram. Now, these archetypes are mythical figures, right? But are they merely products of the imagination, products of superstition and fantasy? Not at all. Not in the least. These archetypes of gods and goddesses are actually forces that work in the universe, and particularly in the human world on Earth. They are forces, they are powers, they are not merely fictional identities invented in groundless fantasy. And when you connect with these engrams, you connect with the deepest wellspring of the life force, not only of the human species and all species on Earth, but you connect with it in a particular way that aligns you to your ancestral memory back to its source. It is those entities and forces that live in your imagination that are ultimately the donors of the two golden eggs. But you can only receive the second one if you know who the donors are. The way it works is simple. The recognition you give to these remote ancestral powers gives you something back in return. It's an exchange of power. So, for instance, if you were of the Nahuatl races of Mexico, you might create a small altar in your house. And you would have on that altar two images, one male and one female. They could be, say, Quetzalcoatl and Xochiquetzal. You notice the name Quetzal is common to the male and female deities. Quetzal is a bird with very bright plumage. So when you find that in a Nahuatl word, it means feathered, like the feathered or plumed serpent. Quetzalcoatl, coatl being the Toltec word for serpent. And you learn the names and you learn the words. You don't have to learn a lot of them, but you learn a few, and they become powerful keys to the depths of your own psychic identity, your own imaginal identity. You see, you don't just have the identity that's on your birth certificate or your driver's license. You have a deep imaginal identity, and you find what it is through your connections at the bottom of the well of ancestral memory. Now, there is actually a practice in planetary tantra of constructing an ancestral altar. The question has come up for me numerous times: do Shaktas, that is, people who practice planetary tantra and revere the Aeonic Mother, do they worship Sophia, or do they worship Thelete, who's the male counterpart of Sophia? No, we don't worship them. We commemorate them. We recognize them. We know where from comes the second golden egg. That is the sensa divina, the sense of your divine origins. It's as simple as that, really. All right then, Well, today we stand about 4 days from the 18th of September, which is the third year anniversary of NEMATA, the Sophianic School of Arts and Sciences. It's also the day of formal publication of the 15th anniversary edition of Not in His Image. And right now I'm working on some material that I'm going to release on the 18th on NEMATA, as well as on YouTube. And part of that material concerns what is called Sophianic animism. And that topic relates intimately to this exercise or practice of ancestral memory that I've just described. So if it catches your interest and you find there's something of value in it for you, there'll be more coming soon on this topic. Enough said, and I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.